Friday night at the Whitmore House, Charlotte's most prestigious fine dining restaurant. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in pristine white linens and sparkling glassware. The soft clink of cutlery against porcelain, the gentle chime of wine glasses, and the flowing notes of jazz from a Steinway piano in the corner blended seamlessly into an atmosphere of refined luxury. Yet beneath the dazzling facade lingered a fragile silence, the kind only those outside of wealth's circle could truly perceive. Amid this elegant tableau, Emily Parker crept. In her hands a silver tray balanced, carrying deep red cocktails and clear tumblers of water that trembled ever so slightly with her steps. Her small black shoes tapped out a swift but steady rhythm, weaving between chairs pulled out abruptly and sidestepping careless movements of the guests. Emily was just another server in the standard black and white uniform to most patrons. But to anyone observant enough to look deeper, her brown eyes revealed something unusual, a hidden flame that had never gone out. On the surface, Emily was a waitress, diligent, composed, politely smiling. But inside, she was a suppressed artist. Since childhood in Savannah, the old church piano had been her sanctuary, where she poured every joy, sorrow, and unspoken thought. Its worn keys sometimes rang unevenly, but to Emily, it was her private world, where she could live as her most authentic self. Reality, however, had never been kind. Her father left when she was still young, burdening her mother, a nurse working double shifts, with raising 3 children alone. The Nashville Conservatory, once Emily's dream, drifted out of reach. The scholarship never came. Family responsibilities grew heavier, bills piled higher. Her ambitions were set aside, replaced with the need to wait tables to survive. Emily chose the Whitmore House not merely for the better paycheck compared to smaller diners, but for a quieter, more personal reason. A piano stood in the corner of this grand dining room. Though she was rarely allowed to touch it, knowing it was there made her feel her dream hadn't entirely. The massive mahogany doors at the entrance to the restaurant swung open, and at once the rhythm of the evening seemed to falter. People recognized him immediately, not only for his tall, broad frame and meticulously slicked-back silver hair, but for the arrogance radiating from every step he took. Richard Grayson, millionaire investor and one of Charlotte's most notorious businessmen, entered with a party of lavishly dressed companions. He didn't just walk in, he claimed the room, pulling the attention of diners and staff alike without a word. Richard carried with him an atmosphere all his own, a voice pitched louder than necessary, a perpetual half-smile, and eyes that pierced as much as they belittled. The men around him, young entrepreneurs and upper-crust elites, laughed dutifully at every boast he dropped, like a chorus feeding his enormous ego. They made their way to a large table placed directly beside the grand piano, bathed in golden light designed to keep Richard squarely at the center of attention. Emily glanced up briefly as Richard sat down. She had heard the whispers from her co-workers about this difficult guest, the man known for testing staff, sometimes with the cruel little games of the wealthy. To Emily, however, he was just another customer on another long shift, and she held tightly to her familiar shield, professionalism and silence. But Richard had other ideas. When he took the menu from Emily's hands, his gaze lingered longer than necessary. A smirk curled across his lips, the smirk of a man who had just found his evening's entertainment. "Emily, isn't it?" he said, reading the name from the small tag pinned to her uniform, his voice drawn out like a cat toying with prey. Emily nodded calmly. "Yes, sir. I'll return as soon as you're ready to order." He gave no reply. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, eyes tracking her as she moved away, as if already marking his target. The half-smile deepened. Richard had chosen Emily as the centerpiece of his night. No one in the dining room knew what was coming, but those familiar with that look understood. A spectacle of humiliation was about to be staged. Richard Grayson could not know. The dining room gradually faded into its old rhythm, the soft clink of cutlery against porcelain, the hum of muted laughter and conversation. But at the table beside the grand piano, Richard Grayson had begun his all-too-familiar performance. He lifted a glass of red wine, swirling the liquid as it caught the light, then raised his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Do you know the difference between those who succeed and those who are ordinary?" he asked, his eyes sweeping the room, half taunt, half expectant. His companions chuckled on cue. "It's us," Richard continued, tapping his manicured hand lightly against his tailored vest. "We dare. We know how to turn everyone else into spectators." A few guests frowned but stayed silent. The heavy air of discomfort did not escape Emily. She carefully set a plate down on the table, maintained her polite smile, and turned to walk away. "Wait, Emily!" Richard's voice cut through, stopping her in her tracks. His entire table fell silent, waiting for the show to begin. Emily turned back, her tone respectful. "Yes, sir?" Richard tilted his head, a glint of mockery flashing in his eyes. "What do you do when you're not serving tables? A young woman like you must have a dream, no?" The question was a shove into space. For a fleeting second, Emily faltered. For years, she had shared almost nothing personal with patrons. But those challenging eyes drew something out of her, and she blurted, I play piano sometimes." Richard burst out laughing, the sound booming across the table, then jabbed his finger toward the corner of the room where the grand piano shimmered under the lights. "Perfect! Then let's hear a little talent. A rare opportunity, Emily. A luxurious hall, a magnificent piano, and an elite audience. What are you waiting for?" His table erupted into snickers. A few nearby guests turned to watch, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. I can't. I'm working, sir." "Oh, don't be so modest," Richard sneered, raising his voice higher now, intentionally drawing the entire Richard, waiting for Emily to prove what he had never imagined. The dining room slowly slipped back into its rhythm. The faint clink of cutlery, the murmur of subdued laughter. But at the table beside the grand piano, Richard Grayson had begun his familiar performance. He raised a glass of red wine, swirling the shimmering liquid, then lifted his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Do you know what sets the successful apart from the ordinary?" he asked, his gaze sweeping across the room, half a provocation, half an invitation for applause. His entourage chuckled in unison. "It's us," he continued, patting his chest lightly through the delicate fabric of his tailored vest. "We dare. We know how to turn everyone else into spectators." A few guests frowned but remained silent. The heavy discomfort in the air was something Emily felt acutely. She gently set down a plate, maintained her polite smile, and turned to leave. "Hold on, Emily!" Richard's voice rang out, halting her steps. His entire table hushed, awaiting the start of his performance. Emily turned back, her tone measured, courteous. "Yes, sir?" Richard tilted his head, a mocking glint flickering in his eyes. "What do you do when you're not serving tables? A young woman like you must have a dream, don't you?" The question struck like a shove into emptiness. For a brief moment, Emily faltered. For years, she had rarely revealed anything personal to customers, but those taunting eyes drew it out of her, and the words slipped. I play piano sometimes." Richard burst out laughing, his booming voice carrying across the table. He pointed toward the corner of the room where the grand piano shimmered under the lights. "Perfect! Then show us a little talent. A rare chance, Emily. A luxurious hall, a magnificent piano, and a refined audience. What are you waiting for?" His companions snickered. A few nearby guests turned their heads, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Emily stood frozen, her heartbeat pounding. I can't. I'm working, sir." "Oh, don't be so modest," Richard pressed, narrowing his eyes, his voice rising deliberately to draw the entire room. Prove what he had never imagined. As the applause slowly faded, Emily rose from the piano bench. Her hands still trembled slightly, but her eyes shone, steady, resolute, brighter than ever. The entire room still seemed to echo with the resonance of the melody, music that had not only reached the ears but also seeped deep into the hearts. Everyone stood, clapping, except for one. In the corner of the room, Richard Grayson sat frozen, his expression caught between two extremes. The arrogance that had always defined him, and the undeniable truth that had just struck him like a blow through the piano's keys. He could not dismiss what had happened. He could not deny the talent the entire room had just witnessed. Finally, clinging to a shred of dignity, Richard curled his lips into a half-smile and spoke. "Quite surprising indeed. It seems, sometimes, talent emerges from the most unexpected places." It sounded like a compliment, but everyone could hear the emptiness behind it. There was no sincerity, only the feeble attempt of a man trying to salvage the scraps of his authority. Emily turned, meeting his eyes directly. No fear, no bitterness, no urge for retaliation, only a calmness that carried the weight of truth. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft yet carrying across the room. "But talent isn't something you prove to anyone. Everyone carries a gift inside them. What matters is how we choose to use it." Her words cut like a thin, sharp blade, not loud, not theatrical, but sharp enough to silence Richard completely. His companions shifted uncomfortably, lowering their gazes, unwilling to add a word. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted entirely. What had been tense moments earlier gave way to a quiet release, as though the balance of power had tipped fully toward the young waitress. Richard, the man who had strutted in like a conqueror, was left mute in the face of a truth too clear to deny. Emily bowed to the room before returning to her duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But her steps were different now, not lowered, not hesitant. She moved with confidence, with the bearing of someone who had As the applause faded, La Fontaine returned to its usual rhythm, the gentle clinking of cutlery against porcelain, the low murmur of conversation, the soft laughter drifting from a few tables. Yet in the air remained an undercurrent, a lingering resonance that no one could quite brush aside. Every gaze toward Emily had changed. Moments ago she had been only a young woman carrying trays of water, taking orders, smiling politely, in a plain uniform. Now, she had become the focal point of respect. A regular guest, Mr. Peterson, the aging lawyer who dined at La Fontaine every Friday, motioned for her as she brought out his coffee. "Young lady," he said, his voice raspy yet full of feeling, "tonight, you reminded us of something. Talent doesn't need permission to shine. Keep going. Don't let anyone extinguish it." Emily could only bow her head in thanks. Her heart trembled, not with fear, but because she felt the weight of belief coming from strangers for the first time in years. Even her colleagues in the kitchen had noticed. Jorge, the stern head chef rarely known for praise, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Chica, tonight, you didn't just serve food. You served their souls." Emily laughed softly, quickly turned away, afraid her eyes might betray the tears. Meanwhile, at the back of the dining room, Richard Grayson still sat, trying to cling to a shred of dignity with awkward conversation among his companions. But no one at his table seemed engaged. When cast toward Emily, their glances carried respect, something Richard could never purchase with money. When the last guests had left that night, Emily cleared the tables, her heart oddly light. The compliments, applause, and even Richard's silence did not make her proud or arrogant. It simply felt as though she had crossed a threshold. Later, Emily sat before her old piano in her modest rented room. The keys were chipped, the tones uneven, yet she played with a smile. No more hiding, no more regret. Only the steady conviction. The path of music was still waiting for her. That night, Emily slept with a heart full of hope for the first time. In the days that followed, news of that extraordinary evening at La Fontaine spread faster than Emily could have imagined. A few regular patrons recounted it to their friends, and soon the story of the waitress who silenced an entire restaurant began appearing in short social media posts. Some guests even described the night as witnessing an unplanned moment of art that could never be forgotten. Emily, however, kept to her ordinary rhythm. She worked her evening shifts, carried trays of water, and practiced her fingers on the old piano whenever she found the time. For her, what remained after that night was not glamour, but certainty, that music was not a distant dream. It was who she was. One late evening, the restaurant manager handed her a business card as Emily was changing out of her uniform to head home. "Someone asked me to pass this along," he said, his voice tinged with curiosity. On the card was a name well known in Nashville's music circles. Thomas Blake, a producer who had helped young singers rise from bar rooms and coffee houses into professional artistry. Emily held the card, her heartbeat quickening. On the back, scrawled in neat handwriting, were the words, "I was there. You have a voice worth recording. Call me." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat beside her worn wooden piano, her fingers brushing across chipped keys, imagining what it might feel like to step into a real studio. Yet with that vision came the familiar fear. Was she good enough? Was this a real opportunity, or just another fragile promise? The next morning she decided to call. Thomas's voice on the other end was calm, deep, and straight to the point. "I can't promise to make you a star, but I can give you one chance to record a demo, to let the world hear your sound. The rest will be up to you." Emily sat in silence for a few seconds, then whispered, "Yes, I'm ready." That was the first real door to open on Emily's musical journey, not because of Richard Grayson, not as an act of revenge, but because she had dared to stand up and let her music speak where silence once lived. And now, the dream she once put aside was knocking once more. On the appointed day, Emily stepped into a small recording studio on the outskirts of Nashville. It wasn't the glamorous space she had once imagined. Gray soundproofed walls, a short grand piano, and a few microphones suspended from the ceiling. But that simplicity only made her heartbeat quicken. For the first time in her life, she wasn't playing for drunk restaurant patrons or the occasional church service, but for professional ears, people who could decide the course of her future. Thomas Blake stood behind the glass in the control room, headphones on, his eyes focused and steady. He didn't say much, only nodded. "Whenever you're ready, begin." Emily drew a deep breath, her hand resting on the cold keys. For a fleeting moment, she saw herself at 8 years old, sitting in a small room in South Carolina, painstakingly practicing classical pieces on a battered upright. She saw her mother, standing at the doorway, exhausted from double shifts yet smiling in encouragement. And she saw that night at La Fontaine, when Richard tried to make her a spectacle. But her music silenced the entire room. Her fingers began to move, no longer trembling as they had in the restaurant. This time Emily played as if she were releasing years of restraint, pain, sacrifice, and the fragile hope her mother had instilled in her. The piece wasn't flawless, some notes rushed, but within every beat lay truth, undeniable and raw. When the final sound faded, the studio fell into silence. Emily lifted her head, her hands still resting on the keys. Thomas removed his headphones, stepped out, and his sharp eyes carried a glint of something rare. "Emily," he said slowly, "you don't just play. You tell stories through music. And that's what the world needs." The words marked a turning point. Not a promise of fame, not some distant fantasy, but genuine recognition. Her first from someone inside the industry. Emily felt her chest lighten, like the years spent hidden beneath a waitress's apron had finally been shed. A few weeks later, the demo found its way into the hands of Thomas's contacts. Before long, a rising young singer invited Emily to news of Emily's performance at La Fontaine, and later her first demo soon spread beyond the small circle of the studio. A short article in the Raleigh Arts Weekly called her "The Waitress Who Played Truth." The waitress who played notes of truth. It wasn't a sensational headline, but a story that touched many readers deeply. A few days later, a secretly recorded clip of Emily playing piano at La Fontaine began circulating on social media. At first, it had only a few hundred views, then thousands, then tens of thousands. People shared it with captions like, "Disappointment is the most beautiful silence I've ever seen in a restaurant." She doesn't just play, she lives inside every note. A lesson for those who belittle others. True talent never needs bragging. Emily continued working at the restaurant, but the atmosphere had shifted. When customers recognized her as the girl from the clip, they no longer saw her as just a server carrying trays. They saw her as an artist, temporarily wearing an apron. Many strangers stopped her to say, "Thank you for that music." An elderly couple even slipped a small card into her hand that read, "Never stop playing. The world needs this." The turning point came when Emily was invited to perform at a community concert at the Raleigh Arts Center, where local young artists gathered to share music. This time, there were no fine dining tables, no mocking laughter from Richard Grayson, only the soft golden glow of stage lights and rows of ordinary people, eager to listen. Before sitting at the piano, Emily's hands trembled slightly. But then she remembered her mother's words. "Never let anyone make you small. You're bigger than they'll ever know." And in that instant, She realized that music was no longer something to fear being judged for. It was a gift to share. The first notes rose, again Clair de Lune, but this time gentler, like an intimate conversation rather than a declaration. When the final notes faded, the hall was drenched in silence, then erupted into waves of applause. Many rose to their feet, some with tears in their eyes. Emily bowed, tears streaming down her face as well. This was no longer. That night, after the community performance, Emily sat alone by the old piano in her small apartment. Her hands still trembled with aftershocks, but inside her rose a different stillness, a quiet certainty. She realized that the path she was walking was no longer just the dream of becoming an artist, but a thread stretching outward, touching the hearts of others. Her phone buzzed, a message from a stranger. "I once gave up learning piano because I thought I wasn't good enough. But after watching your video, I've decided to start again. Thank you." Emily read it, then smiled softly. She remembered those long years, hiding her gift behind a waitress's uniform, bowing her head before customers, quietly carrying her passion in the shadows. And then, in just one moment, when she was challenged and belittled, she had been forced to let her authentic voice be heard. That night at La Fontaine was no longer humiliation, but the beginning of everything that followed. In her journal, Emily wrote one short line. "My music never disappeared. It was only waiting for me to step into the light." For Emily, legacy was not money nor fame. Legacy was the moment a little girl in the audience wanted to learn piano because she was inspired. Legacy was when an adult, weighed down by life, suddenly longed to return to the neglected piano sitting silent for years. And legacy was the moment she could stand tall, lift her head, and confidently say, "Everyone has a gift. The question isn't whether you have talent, but whether you dare to use it to make this world better." In the silence of her small room, Emily closed the piano lid, her hands resting on the wood as if bidding farewell to an old friend. But she knew this wasn't an ending. It was only the first chapter of a new journey. And for the audience of Deep Life Tales, have you ever hidden your gift out of fear or doubt? Maybe it's time to let it speak, just like Emily. If this story touched you, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this video to spread the power of belief and perseverance. Who knows? You might be the inspiration someone out there is waiting for.